Hi friends, Prepared Suburbanite here. Made this video in a response to a viewer comment that I got on a previous video. And here's what he said. Is there anything that preppers are not scared of? Is that what life is all about? Living from fear to fear. Never really safe, never really secure. That's a hell of a way to live. Back in a sec with my thoughts and comments. So the question is, does fear motivate a prepper? And you know, I've got to be the first to admit that there is an element of fear that is a very powerful motivator. But that fear is based on a couple of very simple dynamics. Personal experience, news reports, drivers, and I'll get into what I mean by the drivers in just a second, and accepting responsibility and accepting reality. Those, I think, are really the motivators for being a prepper. Now, when I say, yeah, I'll be the first to admit that fear is a motivator, fear based on experience, fear based on news reports. I've lived through natural disasters, survived them, lived to tell about them, and they were not pleasant. Very inconvenient. I lived through a flood that was absolutely devastating in my hometown back in 1972. The Hurricane Agnes came through, and we got 15 or 18 inches of rain in like 36 hours. The river overflowed its banks, flooded the entire lowlands of the city, took out bridges, transportation was hampered, people lost their possessions, cars were ruined, homes were ruined, furnishings, you name it. But it was temporary. People rebuilt, things got back to order, but that town never really came back from that. But there was a lesson to be learned from that, and that's being prepared. Being prepared, and by that I mean knowing that those folks that lived in the lowlands, those that were in the floodplain, they lost everything. So from that lesson, I learned never to buy or build in a floodplain, and I never will. I always look for the high ground so that I don't have to worry about the flood, and that's based on personal experience. We hear news reports every day, and have for years and years, about religious persecution and the impact of war and civil war in other countries, and what it does to the citizenry, and economic collapse like is going on in Venezuela right now, and what happened in Cuba after Castro took over, those kinds of things. Those are real. But because they happen so far away that we don't feel them directly here, it's still an element of fear. But it's grounded in reality and the acceptance of reality that, yes, it could happen here. And we have to be responsible for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, and for our country. Those need drivers that I mentioned a little bit ago, if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very base foundation of his hierarchy of needs is physiological. And guess what that includes? Air, food, and water. Well, what are the basics for prepping? Air, food, and water. Yep, you got to have those things. Food and water very in particular. Air, well, yeah, I guess we all need it, and if we don't have it, we're not going to be around very much longer. But if we're in a situation with radioactive fallout and things like that, are you ready? Have you prepared for those kinds of eventualities? But the more common is food and water. Do you have enough food storage to get you through temporary setbacks or even long-term setbacks. If we have an economic collapse and the transportation system shut down and the grocery stores can't get inventory shipped in because the grid is down or whatever awful thing can happen, do you have enough food and water on hand to allow your family to survive until the rebuilding can occur? That's a question grounded in reality, the acceptance of reality, and taking personal responsibility. I believe that this commenter was experiencing what is normally termed normalcy bias. And I had to go look it up so I could get a dictionary type definition for it. Here we go. It's the mental state of disbelieving one's situation or being in denial of one's situation when faced with grave and imminent danger. To believe that things will always function the way that things always functioned. Well, I guess maybe the difference between the commenter's point of view and my point of view is the definition of grave and imminent danger. Just because it hasn't happened, that we haven't engaged in a civil war for over 150 years here in the United States, or that we haven't been attacked by a foreign power since the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, that doesn't mean that it can't happen. That doesn't mean that it won't happen. But just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean that it's never going to happen. So if you can accept that there is an element of reality involved in the world that could and possibly will affect our day-to-day normal lives, then by all means, don't prepare for it. But if you really do believe that there is an imminent danger of these kinds of things occurring, then I would urge you all to prepare, to have enough food and water on hand to survive for minimum of 3 to 4 months, and for as long as you can. Some folks have invested so much that they believe that they can exist for 2 years without ever having to go replenish their stock and supplies, and that they'd be okay, they'd survive if it really does take that long to rebuild and reconstitute a sense of normal. So to kind of wrap up my thoughts here, yeah, I think fear does have a role as a motivator, being a prepper, but that fear is very simply based in experience, exposure to news, your own needs as defined in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, personal responsibility, and accepting the reality that these things may occur. This is the Prepared Suburbanite, reminding you to be prepared always, and I'm out for now.